Section 14 of In the Midst of Life, Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, Parker Adderson, Philosopher. Prisoner, what is your name? As I am to lose it at daylight tomorrow morning, it is hardly worth while concealing it. Parker Adderson. Your rank? A somewhat humble one. Commissioned officers are too precious to be risked in the perilous business of a spy. I am a sergeant. Of what regiment? You must excuse me. My answer might, for anything I know, give you an idea of whose forces are in your front. Such knowledge as that is what I came into your lines to obtain, not to impart. You are not without wit. If you have the patience to wait, you will find me dull enough to morrow. How do you know that you are to die to morrow morning? Among spies captured by night that is the custom. It is one of the nice observances of the profession. The general so far laid aside the dignity appropriate to a Confederate officer of high rank and wide renown as to smile. But no one in his power and out of his favor would have drawn any happy augury from that outward and visible sign of approval. It was neither genial nor infectious. It did not communicate itself to the other persons exposed to it. The caught spy who had provoked it and the armed guard who had brought him into the tent and now stood a little apart, watching his prisoner in the yellow candlelight. It was no part of that warrior's duty to smile. He had been detailed for another purpose. The conversation was resumed. It was in character a trial for a capital offense. "You admit, then, that you are a spy; that you came into my camp, disguised as you are in the uniform of a Confederate soldier, to obtain information secretly regarding the numbers and disposition of my troops." "Regarding particularly their numbers. Their disposition I already knew. It is morose." The general brightened again. The guard, with a severer sense of his responsibility, accentuated the austerity of his expression and stood a trifle more erect than before. Twirling his gray slouch hat round and round upon his forefinger, the spy took a leisurely survey of his surroundings. They were simple enough. The tent was a common wall tent, about 8 feet by 10 in dimensions, lighted by a single tallow candle stuck into the haft of a bayonet, which was itself stuck into a pine table, at which the general sat, now busily writing and apparently forgetful of his unwilling guest. An old rag carpet covered the earthen floor. An older leather trunk, a second chair, and a roll of blankets were about all else that the tent contained. In General Clavering's command, Confederate simplicity and penury of pomp and circumstance had attained their highest development. On a large nail driven into the tent pole at the entrance was suspended a sword belt supporting a long sabre, a pistol in its holster, and, absurdly enough, a bowie knife. Of that most unmilitary weapon it was the general's habit to explain that it was a souvenir of the peaceful days when he was a civilian. It was a stormy night. The rain cascaded upon the canvas in torrents, with the dull, drum-like sound familiar to dwellers in tents. As the whooping blasts charged upon it, the frail structure shook and swayed and strained at its confining stakes and ropes. The general finished writing, folded the half sheet of paper, and spoke to the soldier guarding Adderson. "Here, Tassman, take that to the adjutant general. Then return." "And the prisoner, General?" said the soldier, saluting, with an inquiring glance in the direction of that unfortunate. "Do as I said," replied the officer curtly. The soldier took the note and ducked himself out of the tent. General Clavering turned his handsome face toward the Federal spy, looked him in the eyes, not unkindly, and said, "It is a bad night, my man. For me, yes. Do you guess what I have written? Something worth reading, I dare say, and perhaps it is my vanity I venture to suppose that I am mentioned in it. Yes, it is a memorandum for an order to be read to the troops at Reveille concerning your execution, also some notes for the guidance of the provost marshal in arranging the details of that event. I hope, General, the spectacle will be intelligently arranged, for I shall attend it myself. Have you any arrangements of your own that you wish to make? Do you wish to see a chaplain, for example?" I could hardly secure a longer rest for myself by depriving him of some of his. "Good God, man! Do you mean to go to your death with nothing but jokes upon your lips? Do you know that this is a serious matter?" "How can I know that? I have never been dead in all my life. I have heard that death is a serious matter, but never from any of those who have experienced it." The General was silent for a moment. The man interested, perhaps amused him, a type not previously encountered. "Death," he said, "is at least a loss of such happiness as we have, and of opportunities for more. A loss of which we shall never be conscious can be borne with composure, and therefore expected without apprehension. You must have observed, General, that of all the dead men with whom it is your soldierly pleasure to strew your path, none shows signs of regret." "If the being dead is not a regrettable condition, yet the becoming so, the act of dying, appears to be distinctly disagreeable to one who has not lost the power to feel." "Pain is disagreeable, no doubt. I never suffer it without more or less discomfort, but he who lives longest is most exposed to it. What you call dying is simply the last pain. There is really no such thing as dying. Suppose, for illustration, that I attempt to escape. You lift the revolver that you are courteously concealing in your lap, and—" The General blushed like a girl, then laughed softly, disclosing his brilliant teeth, made a slight inclination of his handsome head, and said nothing. The spy continued, "You fire, and I have in my stomach what I did not swallow. I fall, but am not dead. After a half hour of agony I am dead. But at any given instant of that half hour I was either alive or dead. There is no transition period. When I am hanged to morrow morning it will be quite the same. While conscious I shall be living; when dead, unconscious. Nature appears to have ordered the matter quite in my interest, the way that I should have ordered it myself. It is so simple," he added with a smile, "that it seems hardly worth while to be hanged at all." At the finish of his remarks there was a long silence. The General sat impassive, looking into the man's face, but apparently not attentive to what had been said. It was as if his eyes had mounted guard over the prisoner while his mind concerned itself with other matters. Presently he drew a long, deep breath, shuddered, as one awakened from a dreadful dream, and exclaimed almost inaudibly, "Death is horrible!" This man of death. "It was horrible to our savage ancestors," said the spy, gravely, "because they had not enough intelligence to dissociate the idea of consciousness from the idea of the physical forms in which it is manifested, as an even lower order of intelligence, that of the monkey, for example, may be unable to imagine a house without inhabitants, and seeing a ruined hut fancies a suffering occupant. To us it is horrible because we have inherited the tendency to think it so, accounting for the notion by wild and fanciful theories of another world, as names of places give rise to legends explaining them and reasonless conduct to philosophies in justification. You can hang me, General, but there your power of evil ends. You cannot condemn me to heaven." The general appeared not to have heard. The spy's talk had merely turned his thoughts to an unfamiliar channel, but there they pursued their will independently to conclusions of their own. The storm had ceased, and something of the solemn spirit of the night had imparted itself to his reflections, giving them the somber tinge of a supernatural dread. Perhaps there was an element of prescience in it. "I should not like to die," he said. "Not to night." He was interrupted, if indeed he had intended to speak further, by the entrance of an officer of his staff, Captain Hasterlick, the provost marshal. This recalled him to himself. The absent look passed away from his face. "Captain," he said, acknowledging the officer's salute, "this man is a Yankee spy, captured inside our lines with incriminating papers on him. He has confessed. How is the weather?" "The storm is over, sir, and the moon shining." "Good. Take a file of men, conduct him at once to the parade ground, and shoot him." A sharp cry broke from the spy's lips. He threw himself forward, thrust out his neck, expanded his eyes, clenched his hands. "Good God!" he cried hoarsely, almost inarticulately. "You do not mean that! You forget. I am not to die until morning." "I have said nothing of morning," replied the general coldly. "That was an assumption of your own. You die now." "But, General, I beg, I implore you to remember. I am to hang. It will take some time to erect the gallows 2 hours, an hour. Spies are hanged. I have rights under military law. For heaven's sake, General, consider how short Captain, observe my directions." The officer drew his sword, and, fixing his eyes upon the prisoner, pointed silently to the opening of the tent. The prisoner hesitated. The officer grasped him by the collar and pushed him gently forward. As he approached the tent pole the frantic man sprang to it, and with cat like agility seized the handle of the bowie knife, plucked the weapon from the scabbard, and, thrusting the captain aside, leaped upon the general with the fury of a madman, hurling him to the ground and falling headlong upon him as he lay. The table was overturned, the candle extinguished, and they fought blindly in the darkness. The provost marshal sprang to the assistance of his superior officer, and was himself prostrated upon the struggling forms. Curses and inarticulate cries of rage and pain came from the welter of limbs and bodies. The tent came down upon them, and beneath its hampering and enveloping folds the struggle went on. Private Tassman, returning from his errand, and dimly conjecturing the situation, threw down his rifle, and laying hold of the flouncing canvas at random, vainly tried to drag it off the men under it. And the sentinel who paced up and down in front, not daring to leave his beat though the sky should fall, discharged his rifle. The report alarmed the camp. Drums beat the long roll and bugles sounded the assembly, bringing swarms of half clad men into the moonlight, dressing as they ran, and falling into line at the sharp commands of their officers. This was well. Being in line, the men were under control. They stood at arms, while the general's staff and the men of his escort brought order out of confusion by lifting off the fallen tent, and pulling apart the breathless and bleeding actors in that strange contention. Breathless indeed was one. The captain was dead. The handle of the bowie knife, protruding from his throat, was pressed back beneath his chin until the end had caught in the angle of the jaw, and the hand that delivered the blow had been unable to remove the weapon. In the dead man's hand was his sword, clenched with a grip that defied the strength of the living. Its blade was streaked with red to the hilt. Lifted to his feet, the general sank back to the earth with a moan and fainted. Besides his bruises, he had two sword thrusts, one through the thigh, the other through the shoulder. The spy had suffered the least damage. Apart from a broken right arm, his wounds were such only as might have been incurred in an ordinary combat with nature's weapons. But he was dazed and seemed hardly to know what had occurred. He shrank away from those attending him, cowered upon the ground, and uttered unintelligible remonstrances. His face, swollen by blows and stained with gouts of blood, nevertheless showed white beneath his dishevelled hair, as white as that of a corpse. "The man is not insane," said the surgeon, preparing bandages and replying to a question. "He is suffering from fright. Who and what is he?" Private Tassman began to explain. It was the opportunity of his life. He omitted nothing that could in any way accentuate the importance of his own relation to the night's events. When he had finished his story and was ready to begin it again, nobody gave him any attention. The general had now recovered consciousness. He raised himself upon his elbow, looked about him, and seeing the spy crouching by a camp fire, guarded, said simply, "Take that man to the parade ground and shoot him." "The general's mind wanders," said an officer standing near. "His mind does not wander," the adjutant general said. "I have a memorandum from him about this business. He had given that same order to Hasterlick," with a motion of the hand toward the dead provost marshal, "and by God it shall be executed." 10 minutes later Sergeant Parker Adderson, of the Federal Army, philosopher and wit, kneeling in the moonlight and begging incoherently for his life, was shot to death by 20 men. As the volley rang out upon the keen air of the midnight, General Clavering, lying white and still in the red glow of the camp fire, opened his big blue eyes, looked pleasantly upon those about him, and said, "How silent it all is!" The surgeon looked at the adjutant general gravely and significantly. The patient's eyes slowly closed, and thus he lay for a few moments. Then, his face suffused with a smile of ineffable sweetness, he said faintly, "I suppose this must be death," and so passed away. Section 15 of In the Midst of Life, Tales of Soldiers and Civilians. An Affair of Outposts. Reader's Note: In order to understand the full import of this story, one must remember the superstition that the body of a murdered man will bleed if touched by his murderer. Part I. Concerning the Wish to be Dead. Two men sat in conversation. One was the governor of the state. The year was 1861. The war was on, and the governor already famous for the intelligence and zeal with which he directed all the powers and resources of his state to the service of the Union. "What, you?" the governor was saying, in evident surprise. "You too want a military commission? Really, the fifing and drumming must have effected a profound alteration in your convictions. In my character of recruiting sergeant, I suppose I ought not to be fastidious, but" there was a touch of irony in his manner "well, have you forgotten that an oath of allegiance is required?" "I have altered neither my convictions nor my sympathies," said the other tranquilly. "While my sympathies are with the South, as you do me the honor to recollect, I have never doubted that the North was in the right. I am a Southerner in fact and in feeling, but it is my habit in matters of importance to act as I think, not as I feel." The governor was absently tapping his desk with a pencil. He did not immediately reply. After a while he said, "I have heard that there are all kinds of men in the world, so I suppose there are some like that, and doubtless you think yourself one. I've known you a long time, and pardon me I don't think so." "Then I am to understand that my application is denied?" "Unless you can remove my belief that your Southern sympathies are in some degree a disqualification, yes. I do not doubt your good faith, and I know you to be abundantly fitted by intelligence and special training for the duties of an officer. Your convictions, you say, favor the Union cause, but I prefer a man with his heart in it. The heart is what men fight with." "Look here, Governor," said the younger man, with a smile that had more light than warmth, "I have something up my sleeve, a qualification which I had hoped it would not be necessary to mention. A great military authority has given a simple recipe for being a good soldier. Try always to get yourself killed. It is with that purpose that I wish to enter the service. I am not, perhaps, much of a patriot, but I wish to be dead." The Governor looked at him rather sharply, then a little coldly. "There is a simpler and franker way," he said. "In my family, sir," was the reply, "we do not do that. No Armisted has ever done that." A long silence ensued, and neither man looked at the other. Presently the Governor lifted his eyes from the pencil, which had resumed its tapping, and said, "Who is she?" "My wife." The Governor tossed the pencil into the desk, rose and walked 2 or 3 times across the room. Then he turned to Armisted, who also had risen, looked at him more coldly than before, and said, "But the man would it not be better that he could not the country spare him better than it can spare you? Or are the Armisteds opposed to the unwritten law?" The Armisteds apparently could feel an insult. The face of the younger man flushed, then paled, but he subdued himself to the service of his purpose. "The man's identity is unknown to me," he said calmly enough. "Pardon me," said the Governor, with even less of visible contrition than commonly underlies those words. After a moment's reflection he added, "I shall send you to morrow a captain's commission in the 10th Infantry, now at Nashville, Tennessee. Good night." "Good night, sir. I thank you." Left alone, the Governor remained for a time motionless, leaning against his desk. Presently he shrugged his shoulders as if throwing off a burden. "This is a bad business," he said. Seating himself at a reading table before the fire, he took up the book nearest his hand, absently opening it. His eyes fell upon this sentence: "When God made it necessary for an unfaithful wife to lie about her husband in justification of her own sins, he had the tenderness to endow men with the folly to believe her." He looked at the title of the book. It was "His Excellency the Fool." He flung the volume into the fire. Part II. How to say what is worth hearing. The enemy, defeated in 2 days of battle at Pittsburgh Landing, had sullenly retired to Corinth, whence he had come. For manifest incompetence, Grant, whose beaten army had been saved from destruction and capture by Buell's soldierly activity and skill, had been relieved of his command, which nevertheless had not been given to Buell, but to Halleck, a man of unproved powers, a theorist, sluggish, irresolute. Foot by foot his troops, always deployed in line of battle to resist the enemy's bickering skirmishers, always entrenching against the columns that never came, advanced across the 30 miles of forest and swamp toward an antagonist prepared to vanish at contact, like a ghost at cock‐crow. It was a campaign of excursions and alarums, of reconnaissances and countermarches, of cross purposes and countermanded orders. For weeks the solemn farce held attention, luring distinguished civilians from fields of political ambition to see what they safely could of the horrors of war. Among these was our friend the Governor. At the headquarters of the army and in the camps of the troops from his State he was a familiar figure, attended by the several members of his personal staff, showily horsed, faultlessly betailored, and bravely silk-hatted. Things of charm they were, rich in suggestions of peaceful lands beyond a sea of strife. The bedraggled soldier looked up from his trench as they passed, leaned upon his spade, and audibly damned them to signify his sense of their ornamental irrelevance to the austerities of his trade. "I think, Governor," said General Masterson one day, going into informal session atop of his horse and throwing one leg across the pommel of his saddle, his favorite posture, "I think I would not ride any farther in that direction if I were you. We've nothing out there but a line of skirmishers. That, I presume, is why I was directed to put these siege guns here. If the skirmishers are driven in, the enemy will die of dejection at being unable to haul them away. They're a trifle heavy." There is reason to fear that the unstrained quality of this military humor dropped not as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath the civilian's silk hat. Anyhow, he abated none of his dignity in recognition. "I understand," he said gravely, "that some of my men are out there, a company of the Tenth, commanded by Captain Armisted. I should like to meet him, if you do not mind." "He's worth meeting. But there's a bad bit of jungle out there, and I should advise that you leave your horse and," with a look at the Governor's retinue, "your other impedimenta." The Governor went forward alone and on foot. In a half hour he had pushed through a tangled undergrowth covering a boggy soil, and entered upon firm and more open ground. Here he found a half company of infantry lounging behind a line of stacked rifles. The men wore their accoutrements, their belts, cartridge boxes, haversacks, and canteens. Some, lying at full length on the dry leaves, were fast asleep. Others in small groups gossiped idly of this and that. A few played at cards. None was far from the line of stacked arms. To the civilian's eye the scene was one of carelessness, confusion, indifference. A soldier would have observed expectancy and readiness. At a little distance apart an officer in fatigue uniform, armed, sat on a fallen tree noting the approach of the visitor, to whom a sergeant, rising from one of the groups, now came forward. "I wish to see Captain Armisted," said the Governor. The sergeant eyed him narrowly, saying nothing, pointed to the officer, and taking a rifle from one of the stacks, accompanied him. "This man wants to see you, sir," said the sergeant, saluting. The officer rose. It would have been a sharp eye that would have recognized him. His hair, which but a few months before had been brown, was streaked with gray. His face, tanned by exposure, was seamed as with age. A long, livid scar across the forehead marked the stroke of a sabre. One cheek was drawn and puckered by the work of a bullet. Only a woman of the loyal North would have thought the man handsome. "Armisted, Captain," said the Governor, extending his hand, "do you not know me?" "I know you, sir, and I salute you as the Governor of my State." Lifting his right hand to the level of his eyes, he threw it outward and downward. In the code of military etiquette there is no provision for shaking hands. That of the civilian was withdrawn. If he felt either surprise or chagrin, His face did not betray it. "It is the hand that signed your commission," he said. "And it is the hand " The sentence remains unfinished. The sharp report of a rifle came from the front, followed by another and another. A bullet hissed through the forest and struck a tree near by. The men sprang from the ground, and even before the captain's high, clear voice was done intoning the command "Attention!" had fallen into line in rear of the stacked arms. Again, and now through the din of a crackling fusillade, sounded the strong, deliberate sing song of authority, followed by the rattle of unlocking bayonets. Bullets from the unseen enemy were now flying thick and fast, though mostly well spent, and emitting the humming sound which signified interference by twigs and rotation in the plane of flight. Two or three of the men in the line were already struck and down. A few wounded men came limping awkwardly out of the undergrowth from the skirmish line in front. Most of them did not pause, but held their way with white faces and set teeth to the rear. Suddenly there was a deep, jarring report in front, followed by the startling rush of a shell, which, passing overhead, exploded in the edge of a thicket, setting afire the fallen leaves. Penetrating the den, seeming to float above it like the melody of a soaring bird, rang the slow, aspirated monotones of the captain's several commands, without emphasis, without accent, musical and restful as an evensong under the harvest moon. Familiar with this tranquilizing chant in moments of imminent peril, these raw soldiers of less than a year's training yielded themselves to the spell, executing its mandates with the composure and precision of veterans. Even the distinguished civilian behind his tree, hesitating between pride and terror, was accessible to its charm and suasion. He was conscious of a fortified resolution, and ran away only when the skirmishers, under orders to rally on the reserve, came out of the woods like hunted hares and formed on the left of the stiff little line, breathing hard and thankful for the boon of breath. III. The fighting of one whose heart was not in the quarrel. Guided in his retreat by that of the fugitive wounded, the Governor struggled bravely to the rear through the "bad bit of jungle." He was well winded and a trifle confused. Excepting a single rifle shot now and again, there was no sound of strife behind him. The enemy was pulling himself together for a new onset against an antagonist of whose numbers and tactical disposition he was in doubt. The fugitive felt that he would probably be spared to his country, and only commended the arrangements of Providence to that end, but in leaping a small brook in more open ground, one of the arrangements incurred the mischance of a disabling sprain at the ankle. He was unable to continue his flight, for he was too fat to hop, and after several vain attempts causing intolerable pain, seated himself on the earth to nurse his ignoble disability and deprecate the military situation. A brisk renewal of the firing broke out, and stray bullets came flitting and droning by. Then came the crash of two clean, definite volleys, followed by a continuous rattle, through which he heard the yells and cheers of the combatants, punctuated by thunderclaps of cannon. All this told him that Armisted's little command was bitterly beset, and fighting at close quarters. The wounded men whom he had distanced began to straggle by on either side, their numbers visibly augmented by new levies from the line. Singly and by twos and threes, some supporting comrades more desperately hurt than themselves, but all deaf to his appeals for assistance, they sifted through the underbrush and disappeared. The firing was increasingly louder and more distinct, and presently the ailing fugitives were succeeded by men who strode with a firmer tread, occasionally facing about and discharging their pieces, then doggedly resuming their retreat, reloading as they walked. Two or three fell as he looked, and lay motionless. One had enough life left in him to make a pitiful attempt to drag himself to cover. A passing comrade paused beside him long enough to fire, appraised the poor devil's disability with a look, and moved sullenly on, inserting a cartridge in his weapon. In all this was none of the pomp of war, no hint of glory. Even in his distress and peril the helpless civilian could not forbear to contrast it with the gorgeous parades and reviews held in honor of himself, with the brilliant uniforms, the music, the banners, and the marching. It was an ugly and sickening business; to all that was artistic in his nature, revolting, brutal, in bad taste. "Ah!" he grunted, shuddering. "This is beastly. Where is the charm of it all? Where are the elevated sentiments, the devotion, the heroism, the " From a point somewhere near, in the direction of the pursuing enemy, rose the clear, deliberate sing song of Captain Armisted. The rattle of fewer than a score of rifles could be distinguished through the general uproar, and again that penetrating falsetto, "Cease firing! In retreat, march!" In a few moments this remnant had drifted slowly past the Governor. All to the right of him, as they faced in retiring, the men deployed at intervals of a half dozen paces. At the extreme left and a few yards behind came the captain. The civilian called out his name, but he did not hear. A swarm of men in gray now broke out of cover in pursuit, making directly for the spot where the Governor lay. Some accident of the ground had caused them to converge upon that point. Their line had become a crowd. In a last struggle for life and liberty the Governor attempted to rise, and looking back the captain saw him. Promptly, but with the same slow precision as before, he sang his commands. "Skirmishers, halt!" The men stopped, and, according to rule, turned to face the enemies. "Rally on the right!" And they came in at a run, fixing bayonets and forming loosely on the man at that end of the line. "Forward! To save the Governor of your State! Double quick march!" Only one man disobeyed this astonishing command. He was dead. With a cheer they sprang forward over the 20 or 30 paces between them and their task. The captain, having a shorter distance to go, arrived first, simultaneously with the enemy. A half dozen hasty shots were fired at him, and the foremost man, a fellow of heroic stature, hatless and bare breasted, made a vicious sweep at his head with a clubbed rifle. The officer parried the blow at the cost of a broken arm, and drove his sword to the hilt into the giant's breast. As the body fell, the weapon was wrenched from his hand, and before he could pluck his revolver from the scabbard at his belt, another man leaped upon him like a tiger, fastening both hands upon his throat and bearing him backward upon the prostrate Governor, still struggling to rise. This man was promptly spitted upon the bayonet of a Federal sergeant, and his death grip on the captain's throat loosened by a kick upon each wrist. When the captain had risen he was at the rear of his men, who had all passed over and around him, and were thrusting fiercely at their more numerous but less coherent antagonists. Nearly all the rifles on both sides were empty, and in the crush there was neither time nor room to reload. The Confederates were at a disadvantage in that most of them lacked bayonets. They fought by bludgeoning, and a clubbed rifle is a formidable arm. The sound of the conflict was a clatter like that of the interlocking horns of battling bulls, now and then a pash of a crushed skull, an oath, or a grunt caused by the impact of a rifle's muzzle against the abdomen transfixed by its bayonet. Through an opening made by the fall of one of his men Captain Armisted sprang, with his dangling left arm; in his right hand a full charged revolver, which he fired with rapidity and terrible effect into the thick of the gray crowd. But across the bodies of the slain the survivors in the front were pushed forward by their comrades in the rear, till again they breasted the tireless bayonets. There were fewer bayonets now to breast, a beggarly half dozen, all told. A few minutes more of this rough work, a little fighting back to back, and all would be over. Suddenly a lively firing was heard on the right and the left. A fresh line of Federal skirmishers came forward at a run, driving before them those parts of the Confederate line that had been separated by staying the advance of the centre. And behind these new and noisy combatants, at a distance of 200 or 300 yards, could be seen, indistinct among the trees, a line of battle. Instinctively before retiring, the crowd in gray made a tremendous rush upon its handful of antagonists, overwhelming them by mere momentum, and, unable to use weapons in the crush, trampled them, stamped savagely on their limbs, their bodies, their necks, their faces. Then, retiring with bloody feet across its own dead, it joined the general rout, and the incident was at an end. IV. The great honor the great. The Governor, who had been unconscious, opened his eyes and stared about him, slowly recalling the day's events. A man in the uniform of a major was kneeling beside him. He was a surgeon. Grouped about were the civilian members of the Governor's staff, their faces expressing a natural solicitude regarding their offices. A little apart stood General Masterson, addressing another officer and gesticulating with a cigar. He was saying, "It was the beautifulest fight ever made. By God, sir, it was great." The beauty and greatness were attested by a row of dead, trimly disposed, and another of wounded, less formally placed, restless, half naked, but bravely bebandaged. "How do you feel, sir?" said the surgeon. "I find no wound." "I think I am all right," the patient replied, sitting up. "It is that ankle." The surgeon transferred his attention to the ankle, cutting away the boot. All eyes followed the knife. In moving the leg a folded paper was uncovered. The patient picked it up and carelessly opened it. It was a letter 3 months old, signed Julia. Catching sight of his name in it, he read it. It was nothing very remarkable, merely a weak woman's confession of unprofitable sin, the penitence of a faithless wife deserted by her betrayer. The letter had fallen from the pocket of Captain Armisted. The reader quietly transferred it to his own. An aide de camp rode up and dismounted. Advancing to the Governor, he saluted. "Sir," he said, "I am sorry to find you wounded. The commanding general has not been informed. He presents his compliments, and I am directed to say that he has ordered for to morrow a grand review of the reserve corps in your honor. I venture to add that the general's carriage is at your service if you are able to attend. Be pleased to say to the commanding general that I am deeply touched by his kindness. If you have the patience to wait a few moments, you shall convey a more definite reply." He smiled brightly, and glancing at the surgeon and his assistants, added, "At present, if you will permit an allusion to the horrors of peace, I am in the hands of my friends." The humor of the great is infectious. All laughed who heard. "Where is Captain Armisted?" the Governor asked, not altogether carelessly. The surgeon looked up from his work, pointed silently to the nearest body in the row of dead, the features discreetly covered with a handkerchief. It was so near that the great man could have laid his hand upon it, but he did not. He may have feared that it would bleed. Section 25 of In the Midst of Life, Tales of Soldiers and Civilians. A Watcher by the Dead. I. In an upper room of an unoccupied dwelling in the part of San Francisco known as North Beach lay the body of a man, under a sheet. The hour was near 9 in the evening. The room was dimly lighted by a single candle. Although the weather was warm, the two windows, contrary to the custom which gives the dead plenty of air, were closed and the blinds drawn down. The furniture of the room consisted of but three pieces: an armchair, a small reading stand supporting the candle, and a long kitchen table supporting the body of the man. All these, as also the corpse, seemed to have been recently brought in, for an observer, had there been one, would have seen that all were free from dust, whereas everything else in the room was pretty thickly coated with it, and there were cobwebs in the angles of the walls. Under the sheet the outlines of the body could be traced, even the features, these having that unnaturally sharp definition which seems to belong to faces of the dead, but is really characteristic of those only that have been wasted by disease. From the silence of the room one would rightly have inferred that it was not in the front of the house, facing a street. It really faced nothing but a high breast of rock, the rear of the building being set into a hill. As a neighboring church clock was striking 9 with an indolence which seemed to imply such an indifference to the flight of time that one could hardly help wondering why it took the trouble to strike at all, the single door of the room was opened, and a man entered, advancing toward the body. As he did so, the door closed, apparently of its own volition. There was a grating as of a key turned with difficulty, and the snap of the lock bolt as it shot into its socket. A sound of retiring footsteps in the passage outside ensued, and the man was to all appearance a prisoner. Advancing to the table, he stood a moment looking down at the body. Then, with a slight shrug of the shoulders, walked over to one of the windows and hoisted the blind. The darkness outside was absolute, the panes were covered with dust, but by wiping this away he could see that the window was fortified with strong iron bars crossing it within a few inches of the glass and embedded in the masonry on each side. He examined the other window. It was the same. He manifested no great curiosity in the matter, did not even so much as raise the sash. If he was a prisoner he was apparently a tractable one. Having completed his examination of the room, he seated himself in the arm-chair, took a book from his pocket, drew the stand with its candle alongside, and began to read. The man was young, not more than 30, dark in complexion, smooth-shaven, with brown hair. His face was thin and high-nosed, with a broad forehead and a firmness of the chin and jaw which is said by those having it to denote resolution. The eyes were gray and steadfast, not moving except with definitive purpose. They were now, for the greater part of the time, fixed upon his book, but he occasionally withdrew them and turned them to the body on the table, not, apparently, from any dismal fascination which under such circumstances it might be supposed to exercise upon even a courageous person, nor with a conscious rebellion against the contrary influence which might dominate a timid one. He looked at it as if in his reading he had come upon something recalling him to a sense of his surroundings. Clearly, this watcher by the dead was discharging his trust with intelligence and composure as became him. After reading for perhaps a half hour, he seemed to come to the end of a chapter and quietly laid away the book. He then rose, and taking the reading stand from the floor, carried it into a corner of the room near one of the windows, lifted the candle from it, and returned to the empty fireplace before which he had been sitting. A moment later he walked over to the body on the table, lifted the sheet and turned it back from the head, exposing a mass of dark hair and a thin face cloth, beneath which the features showed with even sharper definition than before. Shading his eyes by interposing his free hand between them and the candle, he stood looking at his motionless companion with a serious and tranquil regard. Satisfied with his inspection, he pulled the sheet over the face again, and returning to the chair, took some matches off the candlestick, put them in the side pocket of his sack coat, and sat down. He then lifted the candle from its socket and looked at it critically, as if calculating how long it would last. It was barely 2 inches long. In another hour he would be in darkness. He replaced it in the candlestick and blew it out. II. In a physician's office in Kearney Street 3 men sat about a table, drinking punch and smoking. It was late in the evening, almost midnight, indeed, and there had been no lack of punch. The gravest of the three, Dr. Helberson, was the host. It was in his rooms they sat. He was about 30 years of age. The others were even younger. All were physicians. "The superstitious awe with which the living regard the dead," said Dr. Helberson, "is hereditary and incurable. One needs no more be ashamed of it than of the fact that he inherits, for example, an incapacity for mathematics or a tendency to lie." The others laughed. "Oughtn't a man to be ashamed to lie?" asked the youngest of the three, who was in fact a medical student not yet graduated. "My dear Harper, I said nothing about that. The tendency to lie is one thing. Lying is another." "But do you think," said the third man, "that this superstitious feeling, this fear of the dead, reasonless as we know it to be, is universal? I am myself not conscious of it." "Oh, but it is in your system, for all that," replied Helberson. "It needs only the right conditions what Shakespeare calls the Confederate season to manifest itself in some very disagreeable way that will open your eyes. Physicians and soldiers are, of course, more nearly free from it than others." "Physicians and soldiers! Why don't you add hangmen and headsmen? Let us have in all the assassin classes." "No, my dear Mancher, the juries will not let the public executioners acquire sufficient familiarity with death to be altogether unmoved by it." Young Harper, who had been helping himself to a fresh cigar at the sideboard, resumed his seat. "What would you consider conditions under which any man of woman born would become insupportably conscious of his share of our common weakness in this regard?" he asked rather verbosely. "Well, I should say that if a man were locked up all night with a corpse, alone, in a dark room, of a vacant house, with no bed covers to pull over his head, and lived through it without going altogether mad, he might justly boast himself not of woman born, nor yet, like Macduff, a product of Caesarean section." "I thought you never would finish piling up conditions," said Harper. "But I know a man who is neither a physician nor a soldier who will accept them all, for any stakes you'd like to name." "Who is he?" "His name is Jarrett. A stranger here. Comes from my town in New York. I have no money to back him, but he will back himself with loads of it." "How do you know that?" "He would rather bet than eat. As for fear, I dare say he thinks it's some cutaneous disorder, or possibly a particular kind of religious heresy. "What does he look like?" Helberson was evidently becoming interested. "Like Mancher here. Might be his twin brother." "I accept the challenge," said Helberson, promptly. "Awfully obliged to you for the compliment, I'm sure," drawled Mancher, who was growing sleepy. "Can't I get into this?" "Not against me," Helberson said. "I don't want your money." "All right," said Mancher. "I'll be the corpse." The others laughed. The outcome of this crazy conversation we have seen. III. In extinguishing his meager allowance of candle, Mr. Jarrett's object was to preserve it against some unforeseen need. He may have thought, too, or half thought, that the darkness would be no worse at one time than another, and if the situation became insupportable it would be better to have a means of relief, or even release. At any rate it was wise to have a little reserve of light, even if only to enable him to look at his watch. No sooner had he blown out the candle and set it on the floor at his side than he settled himself comfortably in the arm chair, leaned back and closed his eyes, hoping and expecting to sleep. In this he was disappointed. He had never in his life felt less sleepy, and in a few minutes he gave up the attempt. But what could he do? He could not go groping about in absolute darkness at the risk of bruising himself, at the risk, too, of blundering against the table and rudely disturbing the dead. We all recognize their right to lie at rest, with immunity from all that is harsh and violent. Jarrett almost succeeded in making himself believe that considerations of this kind restrained him from risking the collision and fixed him to the chair. While thinking of this matter, he fancied that he heard a faint sound in the direction of the table. What kind of sound he could hardly have explained. He did not turn his head. Why should he, in the darkness? But he listened. Why should he not? And listening he grew giddy and grasped the arms of the chair for support. There was a strange ringing in his ears. His head seemed bursting. His chest was oppressed by the constriction of his clothing. He wondered why it was so, and whether these were symptoms of fear. Then, with a long and strong expiration, his chest appeared to collapse, and with a great gasp with which he refilled his exhausted lungs, the vertigo left him, and he knew that so intently had he listened that he had held his breath almost to suffocation. The revelation was vexatious. He arose, pushed away the chair with his foot, and strode to the centre of the room. But one does not stride far in darkness. He began to grope, and finding the wall, followed it to an angle, turned, followed it past the two windows, and there in another corner came into violent contact with the reading stand, overturning it. It made a clatter that startled him. He was annoyed. "How the devil could I have forgotten where it was?" he muttered, and groped his way along the third wall to the fireplace. "I must put things to rights," said he, feeling the floor for the candle. Having recovered that, he lighted it and instantly turned his eyes to the table, where, naturally, nothing had undergone any change. The reading stand lay unobserved upon the floor. He had forgotten to put it to rights. He looked all about the room, dispersing the deeper shadows by movements of the candle in his hand, and, crossing over to the door, tested it by turning and pulling the knob with all his strength. It did not yield, and this seemed to afford him a certain satisfaction. Indeed, he secured it more firmly by a bolt which he had not before observed. Returning to his chair, he looked at his watch. It was 9:30. With a start of surprise he held the watch at his ear. It had not stopped. The candle was now visibly shorter. He again extinguished it, placing it on the floor at his side as before. Mr. Jarrett was not at his ease. He was distinctly dissatisfied with his surroundings and with himself for being so. "What have I to fear?" he thought. "This is ridiculous and disgraceful. I will not be so great a fool." But courage does not come of saying, "I will be courageous," nor of recognizing its appropriateness to the occasion. The more Jarrett condemned himself, the more reason he gave himself for condemnation. The greater the number of variations which he played upon the simple theme of the harmlessness of the dead, the more insupportable grew the discord of his emotions. "What!" he cried aloud in the anguish of his spirit. "What! Shall I, who have not a shade of superstition in my nature, I, who have no belief in immortality, I who know, and never more clearly than now, that the after life is the dream of a desire, shall I lose at once my bet, my honor, and my self respect, perhaps my reason, because certain savage ancestors dwelling in caves and burrows conceived the monstrous notion that the dead walk by night, that Distinctly, unmistakably, Mr. Jarrett heard behind him a light, soft sound of footfalls, deliberate, regular, successively nearer. IV. Just before daybreak the next morning, Dr. Helberson and his young friend Harper were driving slowly through the streets of North Beach in the doctor's coupe. "Have you still the confidence of youth in the courage or stolidity of your friend?" said the elder man. "Do you believe that I have lost this wager?" "I know you have," replied the other, with enfeebling emphasis. "Well, upon my soul, I hope so." It was spoken earnestly, almost solemnly. There was a silence for a few moments. "Harper," the doctor resumed, looking very serious in the shifting half lights that entered the carriage as they passed the street lamps, "I don't feel altogether comfortable about this business. If your friend had not irritated me by the contemptuous manner in which he treated my doubt of his endurance, a purely physical quality, and by the cool incivility of his suggestion that the corpse be that of a physician, I should not have gone on with it. If anything should happen, we are ruined, as I fear we deserve to be." "What can happen? Even if the matter should be taking a serious turn, of which I am not at all afraid, Mancher has only to resurrect himself and explain matters. With a genuine subject from the dissecting room, or one of your late patients, it might be different." Dr. Mancher, then, had been as good as his promise. He was the corpse. Dr. Helberson was silent for a long time, as the carriage, at a snail's pace, crept along the same street it had traveled 2 or 3 times already. Presently he spoke. "Well, let us hope that Mancher, if he has had to rise from the dead, has been discreet about it. A mistake in that might make matters worse instead of better." "Yes," said Harper. "Jarrett would kill him. But, doctor," looking at his watch as the carriage passed a gas lamp, "it is nearly 4 o'clock at last." A moment later the two had quitted the vehicle and were walking briskly toward the long unoccupied house belonging to the doctor in which they had immured Mr. Jarrett in accordance with the terms of the mad wager. As they neared it they met a man running. "Can you tell me," he cried suddenly, checking his speed, "where I can find a doctor?" "What's the matter?" Helberson asked, noncommittal. "Go and see for yourself," said the man, resuming his running. They hastened on. Arrived at the house, they saw several persons entering in haste and excitement. In some of the dwellings near by and across the way the chamber windows were thrown up, showing a protrusion of heads. All heads were asking questions, none heeding the questions of the others. A few of the windows with closed blinds were illuminated. The inmates of those rooms were dressing to come down. Exactly opposite the door of the house that they sought a street lamp threw a yellow, insufficient light upon the scene. seeming to say that it could disclose a good deal more if it wished. Harper paused at the door and laid a hand upon his companion's arm. "It is all up with us, doctor," he said in extreme agitation, which contrasted strangely with his free and easy words. "The game has gone against us all. Let's not go in there. I'm for lying low." "I'm a physician," said Dr. Helberson calmly. "There may be need of one." They mounted the door steps and were about to enter. The door was open; the street lamp opposite lighted the passage into which it opened. It was full of men. Some had ascended the stairs at the farther end, and, denied admittance above, waited for better fortune. All were talking, none listening. Suddenly, on the upper landing, there was a great commotion. A man had sprung out of a door and was breaking away from those endeavoring to detain him. Down through the mass of affrighted idlers he came, pushing them aside, flattening them against the wall on one side, or compelling them to cling to the rail on the other, clutching them by the throat, striking them savagely, thrusting them back down the stairs, and walking over the fallen. His clothing was in disorder. He was without a hat. His eyes, wild and restless, had in them something more terrifying than his apparently superhuman strength. His face, smooth shaven, was bloodless, his hair frost white. As the crowd at the foot of the stairs, having more freedom, fell away to let him pass, Harper sprang forward. "Jarrett! Jarrett!" he cried. Dr. Helberson seized Harper by the collar and dragged him back. The man looked into their faces without seeming to see them, and sprang through the door, down the steps, into the street, and away. A stout policeman, who had had inferior success in conquering his way down the stairway, followed a moment later, and started in pursuit, all the heads in the windows, those of women and children now, screaming in guidance. The stairway being now partly cleared, most of the crowd having rushed down to the street to observe the flight and pursuit, Dr. Helberson mounted to the landing, followed by Harper. At a door in the upper passage an officer denied them admittance. "We are physicians," said the doctor, and they passed in. The room was full of men, dimly seen, crowded about a table. The newcomers edged their way forward and looked over the shoulders of those in the front rank. Upon the table, the lower limbs covered with a sheet, lay the body of a man, brilliantly illuminated by the beam of a bull's eye lantern held by a policeman standing at the feet. The others, excepting those near the head, the officer himself, all were in darkness. The face of the body showed yellow, repulsive, horrible. The eyes were partly open and upturned, and the jaw fallen. Traces of froth defiled the lips, the chin, the cheeks. A tall man, evidently a doctor, bent over the body with his hand thrust under the shirt front. He withdrew it and placed 2 fingers in the open mouth. "This man has been about 6 hours dead," said he. "It is a case for the coroner." He drew a card from his pocket, handed it to the officer, and made his way toward the door. "Clear the room! All out!" said the officer sharply, and the body disappeared as if it had been snatched away, as, shifting the lantern, he flashed its beam of light here and there against the faces of the crowd. The effect was amazing. The men, blinded, confused, almost terrified, made a tumultuous rush for the door, pushing, crowding, and tumbling over one another as they fled, like the hosts of night before the shafts of Apollo. Upon the struggling, trampling mass the officer poured his light without pity and without cessation. Caught in the current, Helberson and Harper were swept out of the room and cascaded down the stairs into the street. "Good God, doctor, did I not tell you that Jarrett would kill him?" said Harper, as soon as they were clear of the crowd. "I believe you did," replied the other. without apparent emotion. They walked on in silence, block after block. Against the graying east the dwellings of the hill tribes showed in silhouette. The familiar milk wagon was already astir in the streets. The baker's man would soon come upon the scene, the newspaper carrier was abroad in the land. "It strikes me, youngster," said Helberson, "that you and I have been having too much of the morning air lately. It is unwholesome. We need a change. What do you say to a tour in Europe?" "When?" "I'm not particular. I should suppose that 4 o'clock this afternoon would be early enough." "I'll meet you at the boat," said Harper. 7 years afterward these two men sat upon a bench in Madison Square, New York, in familiar conversation. Another man, who had been observing them for some time, himself unobserved, approached, and, courteously lifting his hat from locks as white as frost, said, "I beg your pardon, gentlemen, but when you have killed a man by coming to life, it is best to change clothes with him, and at the first opportunity make a break for liberty." Helberson and Harper exchanged significant glances. They were obviously amused. The former then looked the stranger kindly in the eye and replied, "That has always been my plan. I entirely agree with you as to its He stopped suddenly, rose, and went white. He stared at the man open mouthed. He trembled visibly. "Ah?" said the stranger. "I see that you are indisposed, doctor. If you cannot treat yourself, Dr. Harper can do something for you, I am sure." "Who the devil are you?" said Harper bluntly. The stranger came nearer, and bending toward them said in a whisper, "I call myself Jarrett sometimes, but I don't mind telling you, for old friendship, that I am Dr. William Mancher." The revelation brought Harper to his feet. "Mancher!" he cried; and Helberson added, "It is true, by God!" "Yes," said the stranger, smiling vaguely, "it is true enough, no doubt." He hesitated, and seemed to be trying to recall something, then began humming a popular air. He had apparently forgotten their presence. "Look here, Mancher," said the elder of the two, "tell us just what occurred that night to Jarrett, you know." "Oh yes, about Jarrett," said the other. "It's odd I should have neglected to tell you. I tell it so often. You see, I knew, by overhearing him talking to himself, that he was pretty badly frightened. So I couldn't resist the temptation to come to life and have a bit of fun out of him. I couldn't really. That was all right, though certainly I did not think he would take it so seriously. I did not, truly. And afterward well, it was a tough job changing places with him. And then damn you, you didn't let me out." Nothing could exceed the ferocity with which these last words were delivered. Both men stepped back in alarm. "We? Why," Helberson stammered, losing his self possession utterly, "we had nothing to do with it." "Didn't I say you were Doctors Hellborn and Sharper?" inquired the man, laughing. "My name is Helberson, yes, and this gentleman is Mr. Harper," replied the former, reassured by the laugh. "But we are not physicians now. We are well, hang it, old man, we are gamblers." And that was the truth. A very good profession, very good indeed. And, by the way, I hope Sharper here paid over Jarrett's money like an honest stakeholder. A very good and honorable profession," he repeated thoughtfully, moving carelessly away. "But I stick to the old one. I am High Supreme Medical Officer of the Bloomingdale Asylum. It is my duty to cure the superintendent." Section 25.